In the previous video, we introduced this concept of ecocentrism through the last person argument. And that argument seemed to show that it can be, in some sense, morally wrong to destroy nature, even though there's no humans around to be harmed. And a lot of people seem to have this intuition, and this intuition seems to suggest that nature itself, the natural world as a whole, deserves some moral consideration. That these ecosystems are a part of the moral community just as much as you or I happen to be. And as we said previously, that this is a radical shift in our view of the moral community. So, how exactly should we understand this shift? How should we justify it? That's actually going to take us into the direction of holistic ethics, which is what we ended on in the previous video. So holistic ethics is one that gives us a view of moral standing where it's the wholes rather than the individuals that matter. So instead of asking about the well-being of a particular creature, like you or me, or this deer or that person, or maybe my dog Athena, or the cattle that are on farms, instead of thinking about these individual creatures and the well-being of those creatures, then what we're doing is we're thinking about and asking questions with regard to the integrity, the stability, and the flourishing of an entire community rather than just some particular creature. Indeed, holistic ethics challenges us to rethink these deeply ingrained assumptions that are a part of Western moral philosophy. These assumptions that seem to view individuals as the primary unit of moral concern. This is something that's especially the case for philosophers like Aristotle or Kant or utilitarian philosophers who focus on the general well-being of individuals, or Kant's philosophy that focus on rational agents, or maybe just sentient beings if you prefer utilitarianism. So instead of thinking about things in those terms, those traditional westernized views of morality, instead, holistic ethics really turns all of that on its head. It says that the larger system as a whole is actually what's most fundamental. It's more fundamental than the individual parts. And so this way of thinking has radical implications. It means that preserving, for instance, a species as a whole might actually take precedent over the well-being of some particular individual in that species. For example, it might be the case that controlling some invasive species, even by some lethal means, might be justified if doing so preserves the larger ecosystem as a whole. So all of this introduces what's perhaps one of the most influential forms of holistic ethics, which is deep ecology. It's a movement that came out of the 1970s, where basically deep ecology insists that all living beings, humans and non-human animals alike, have intrinsic value. It's not necessarily saying that everything in an ecosystem has the same value, but rather all of it as a whole has intrinsic value. But it goes further. It's claiming that humans should recognize themselves not as conquerors per se, not as conquerors of nature, but as members and citizens of the Earth's community of life. Indeed, deep ecology emphasizes what's sometimes called self-realization, which is the idea that our true identity is not confined to some narrow individual self. Instead, it's extending moral worth, it's extending intrinsic value into the broader ecological system that we inhabit. We're identifying ourselves with nature in this way, where harming the natural world becomes a kind of self-harm. Insofar as we are members of these ecological systems, we're a part of the natural community. And so when we harm a river, when we pollute a river, we are literally harming ourselves. So why is this called deep? What's this notion of deep all about? Well, we call it deep because it doesn't just ask for superficial changes in our behavior, like doing a better job of recycling, or maybe driving less, or all these different things that are certainly good, right? Like spending less money on wasteful products, using single-use, plastic bottles. Like that's certainly bad. We should avoid doing that. It's actually calling for us to make a profound transformation in our worldview itself, a profound change in the way we're thinking about things. So it's not just a change in our behavior, it's a shift in our very sense of ourselves a change and rethinking our relationship to the natural world. Which brings me to this notion of the land ethic. Perhaps it's the most famous articulation of an ecocentric holistic view, which comes from Aldo Leopold and this idea of a land ethic. So essentially, Leopold argues that ethics has historically expanded outward. From the family to the tribe, for instance, and then from the tribe to the nation, then eventually from the nation to all of humanity. And it seems like the next logical step, according to Leopold, is to extend our ethical concerns to include the land itself. Leopold put it this way: the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, animals, the collectivity of everything in the ecosystem, right? And the entire natural world. So that's what he means here by the land. So we're talking about this deep change in our way of thinking, where we're reimagining ourselves not as individual selves, but instead as members of this natural community of the land itself. So then for Leopold, we can think about that as offering a kind of a test for what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong. Where he says a thing is going to be right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends to do otherwise. Now, notice that this is a community based standard, right? It's not a standard for individuals, it's a standard for the collective whole. It doesn't ask us first about interests of the individuals, but instead about the whole ecological community. That's the fundamental holistic way of rethinking our relationships, of our relationships to one another, as well as to the land, as well as to the natural world. So essentially, Leopold is inviting us to see ourselves as members of the ecological community, again, in the same very way that we see ourselves as a part of a family, as a part of a nation, or as a part of a culture, a part of religion. In the same way that we see ourselves a member of these sort of groups, we should also see ourselves as a member of these ecological systems. Or another way of thinking about that is just as you might feel loyalty or duty to any one of these groups, according to Leopold, we should also feel loyalty and duty to the land that we live on. Now, there are important concerns that we should pay attention to. Indeed, these are kind of eco-fascist concerns that I think are important not to ignore. Leopold's land ethic actually raises a lot of problems. If we want to take this sort of view serious, then we should address these issues. If the integrity of the ecological whole, if that's what should come first, then the individual's interests, your interests, my interests, maybe my dog Athena's interests, these interests can be overridden, right? In the same way that, for instance, in the same way that we might consider these issues from a utilitarian perspective, and we might say that it's more important to sacrifice one individual in order to save five people. That same sort of problem can be reintroduced here with regard to holistic ethics. Some critics have actually labeled this tendency, given it the name ecofascism, where the idea is that the individual can be sacrificed for the sake of the ecological whole. While that is certainly an objection that we should pay attention to, I think at the bare minimum we should treat it as a kind of cautionary point, where it's essentially a red flag about the rhetoric that we're using, insofar as our language itself can be co-opted for dangerous political purposes. For instance, some anti-immigration movements might frame immigrants as threats to the integrity of one's culture or to the ecological community. Insofar as somebody might be attempting to link ecological health with racial or national purity, well, then the language of environmentalism can actually be twisted into a kind of warped justification for exclusion and for oppression. So I think those are real worries, something that we should really take serious. Indeed, this is not just some sort of abstract issue. All right, we've already seen, all these sort of far-right movements use ecological themes to support very xenophobic agendas. Indeed, in the current context of the Trump administration, it does not seem at all far-fetched that we can imagine language about protecting our land or preserving our way of life, how this could be very easily turned into to hate speech, essentially, used as a way of excluding people and this kind of nationalist rhetoric. And that's precisely the sort of danger that I think we should be aware of. So now, given that that seems like a really important objection that we should pay attention to, let's think about some possible responses to this kind of problem with eco-fascism. One very common reply is that Leopold himself emphasized that the community metaphor is precisely to guard against authoritarian interpretations. Notice that the land ethic that Leopold is advocating for does not erase individuals, right? It doesn't say there are literally no individuals. Rather, it enlarges the scope of community to include land, water, and non-human life, right? So that does include individuals in some regard, even if we're not thinking about those individuals as like persons per se. So, in the same way that being a part of a family does not eliminate you individually as a part of the family, but places you within the larger web of different relationships, so in that same way, we should think of the ecological community as an enlargement of the community, right? So the moral community gets larger rather than giving us a reason to exclude people or exclude individuals that we may not like. Now, another response to this problem of ecofascism is to point out that this is really actually a perversion of holistic ethics. It's not the conclusion of holistic ethics. So, just as the rhetoric of human rights has oftentimes been misused by imperialist powers, so too environmentalist language can also be misused. So the solution then is to not simply abandon holistic ethics, but instead to make sure that we are articulating it very carefully, making sure that the ecological concerns are not weaponized for exclusionary purposes. Still, you might be worried that there's still problems and things that go unaddressed. So I want to mention that that's not the only view on the offing, right? There are actually other views that one could take too. So for instance, in addition to holistic ethics, which again asks us to see ourselves as members of the entire ecological community, there's also a perspective that's called ecofeminism. And this view critiques not only our relationship to nature, but it also critiques our relation with social systems of domination that structure the relationships. Right? Ecofeminism gives us a chance to consider the connections between environmental degradation and the systems of oppression itself, such as patriarchy, colonialism, and specifically capitalism. So that's what we're going to turn to in a bit more detail in the next video.